Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a really big issue today, why so many of us seem to be struggling with chronic health problems, even when we think we're doing okay.
Yeah,
Because honestly, the statistics are pretty startling. I mean, did you know 6 out of 10 adults in the U.S. are living with a chronic
it's
illness,
staggering.
and 74% are overweight or have obesity? And here's one that really hit me from the source material for this deep dive.
Hmm.
The author's own mother, despite seeing 5 separate specialists, taking 5 different meds, and, being told by her doctor she was healthy,
Right.
she gets a stage 4 pancreatic cancer diagnosis and was dead 13 days later.
Unbelievable.
And this is in a country where, like, 14 prescriptions are written per American per year.
Uh,
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? It isn't adding up.
it's truly pervasive. And what's disturbing is how sort of normalized it's become.
Yeah.
We're often told, these conditions are just part of being human, maybe an inevitable part of aging.
Right, just getting older.
Exactly. But this deep dive, well, it's designed to be your shortcut to understanding a really revolutionary concept from this new book, Good Energy.
Okay.
Our mission here is to pull out the most important insights, to give you a clear, actionable understanding of what's truly impacting your health, and maybe more importantly, what you can actually do about it.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea then. Because the book makes a pretty radical claim, doesn't it? That nearly all chronic physical and mental health issues actually stem from just one single root cause,
Mm-hmm.
a problem with good energy right down at the cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
So could you break down what the book means by good energy, and how does that connect to our cells' powerhouses?
Absolutely. So the book really zeroes in on the mitochondria. You know those powerhouses of the cell you probably remember vaguely from high school biology?
Yeah, vaguely. Powerhouses, right.
They're not just some dusty memory. They are, well, everything when it comes to your health. Your mitochondria, they take the food you eat, convert it into ATP, which is basically the energy currency that every single one of your cells needs for every function. Your brain, your muscles, everything.
Wow.
As the book puts it pretty simply, there's no life without energy. Every thought, every breath, every single muscle movement, it all comes down to those tiny, absolutely crucial mitochondria.
That makes perfect sense. And what I found really thought-provoking is the book's argument that the core problem isn't just that these powerhouses aren't working right, but why.
Right.
It boils down to this concept of an evolutionary mismatch. Our bodies, these incredible machines, they evolved over hundreds, maybe thousands of years for one specific environment.
Mm-hmm. A very different environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But modern life has just profoundly and rapidly changed those conditions. So how does this mismatch create what the author calls bad energy?
Well, it's a stark contrast, isn't it, between what our cells sort of evolved to expect and the reality we live in now.
Yeah.
Our cells are still basically geared up for conditions from millennia ago, sparse food, lots of movement, natural light cycles.
Right. Hunter-gatherer stuff.
Exactly. But now they're operating in this world of like constant food availability, desk jobs, endless artificial light,
24/7.
this constant evolutionary mismatch. It just overwhelms the mitochondria. It makes them inefficient. And that inefficiency, that's what creates bad energy.
Yeah.
And the book illustrates this so powerfully with, real-life examples like the author's own mother, who we mentioned.
That story was powerful.
She started with trouble losing baby weight, dismissed as normal. Then came the elevated blood pressure, high cholesterol, each one met with a new pill.
Mm-hmm.
Doctors complimented her health right up until that absolutely tragic stage 4 diagnosis and her passing so quickly.
Wow.
Her story just hammers home how medical normalcy doesn't always mean you're actually optimally thriving.
That's such a poignant example.
And it's clearly not isolated. I was struck by Sophia's case, too.
Yes, Sophia. Right, a 52-year-old woman. And she has this laundry list of seemingly unrelated issues. Recurrent sinus infections, prediabetes, high blood pressure, back pain, depression.
All treated separately.
Exactly. Each issue handled by a different specialist, different plans.
Yeah.
It's this totally fragmented approach to her health.
Mm-hmm.
But then during a surgery, the author, being a surgeon herself, has this kind of light bulb moment.
Yeah.
What if these seemingly separate things are all related? Maybe linked by inflammation. It wasn't just individual problems. It was a deeper interconnected why.
Precisely. And then you had Sarah, remember, the 36-year-old suffering from those debilitating migraines and inflammatory arthritis.
Right, she was practically housebound.
Yeah. And again, the author wondered if inflammation was the common driver for all of Sarah's symptoms, not just the ENT stuff she specialized in.
Okay.
These cases really just underscore the book's central argument. So many of our chronic conditions, which seem distinct, are actually connected branches of the same metabolic tree. And they're rooted in this cellular bad energy.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If these individual stories are so clear, what does this mean for us collectively?
Yeah.
What struck me reading this is how the book then zooms out. It connects these personal stories to these alarming societal trends, you know?
Right, the bigger picture.
Skyrocketing rates of cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, autoimmune conditions affecting 50 million Americans, mental illness impacting half of us at some point.
It's huge.
Even U.S. life expectancy. It's been declining for the longest sustained period since, like, 1860.
Which is wild.
So is the book arguing these widespread issues are directly linked to these bad energy drivers?
It argues exactly that. And what's fascinating is how the book then distills the main factors, the primary things that are, well, ravaging our mitochondria and our cellular energy production.
Okay.
It really boils it down to a few key areas where life has changed drastically, especially over the last century or so. And these changes are driving this epidemic of bad energy.
Okay, so the first big driver the book points to, no big surprise here, it's diet.
Huge one.
The changes over the last 100 years are just astonishing. We're consuming astronomically more sugar-like, up to 3,000% more liquid fructose.
3,000%.
And refined foods compared to a century ago. This isn't just about calories, right? It leads to toxic fat buildup and something called oxidative stress.
Right, that's cellular rusting.
Yeah, like internal rusting or damage from these unstable molecules, free radicals. And here's a jaw dropper. Ultra-processed foods. They now make up nearly 70% of the calories Americans consume.
70%.
And the book says they're chemically engineered to be addictive.
Which is terrifying when you think about it. And beyond what we're eating, it's also how we're living, or rather how we're not living.
You mean sedentary lifestyles?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The shift to desk jobs, sitting, the book says maybe 80% of our waking hours for many people.
Wow.
This massive lack of movement has a huge impact on cellular health. Movement is absolutely essential for keeping mitochondria working well.
And you can't forget sleep deprivation either. That was another big one.
Oh, absolutely critical.
On average, we're sleeping 25% less than just a century ago.
Yeah.
And the book really highlights how even, like, modest sleep restriction, just getting 4 hours for 6 nights in a row, can actually induce pre-diabetic metabolic changes.
And directly damage mitochondria.
Right. It's such a foundational pillar of health, and for so many of us, it's crumbling.
It really is. And then we're just, well, surrounded by environmental toxins.
Oh, yeah. That section was eye-opening.
Over 80,000 synthetic chemicals in our food, water, air, things like pesticides, phthalates, PFAS, BPA, dioxins, heavy metals.
And they haven't really been tested properly, have they?
Less than 1% have been adequately tested for human safety. And many we know disrupt hormones and, crucially, damage mitochondria.
Scary stuff. Then there's chronic stress. That's another huge driver, right?
Absolutely. Prolonged stress activates cortisol, that fight or flight hormone, and that directly damages mitochondria and generates more of those damaging free radicals. It's like our cells are constantly in this state of perceived threat, which just isn't sustainable long term. And finally, there's artificial light. Our constant exposure, especially at night, to all this artificial blue light, it messes up our circadian rhythms.
Our body clock.
Exactly. Our natural 24-hour body clocks that are meant to be set by natural sunlight cycles. This profound mismatch significantly impacts our metabolic pathways and, you guessed it, cellular energy production.
Okay, so this all leads us to a really crucial part of the book. It's critique of the conventional medical system.
Yeah, this part is quite pointed.
The authors argue that while the system is great at acute issues, broken bones, infections, emergency surgery, it has, quote, lost its way with chronic diseases. And remember, chronic conditions, they account for over 80% of healthcare costs and deaths today.
And what's truly fascinating, or maybe disturbing, are the misaligned incentives the book identifies.
How so?
It details how basically every institution that impacts health, from medical schools to insurance companies to hospitals to pharma companies, makes money on managing disease, not curing patients.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is. The author even recalls a cancer surgeon friend saying, quite bluntly, if you walk through the doors of this surgical oncology department, you're going to get an operation whether you need it or not.
Oof.
It paints this picture of a system where intervention and management are often prioritized, maybe even over finding and curing the root cause.
That's a powerful and, yeah, challenging critique. And this plays out in how doctors are actually trained, right?
It does. They often see multiple chronic conditions as comorbidities.
Right. Just things that happen to go together.
Exactly. But the book argues this leads to treating symptoms in silos. You treat the blood pressure here, the cholesterol there.
Instead of looking at the underlying mess.
Precisely. It's like treating each branch of a dying tree individually without ever looking at the root system, at that core bad energy problem.
And this blind spot, it gets worse because of industry influence.
Yeah, that's another major point. The book highlights that food companies spend 11 times more on nutrition research than the National Institutes of Health.
11.
Yep. Leading to findings that are, perhaps unsurprisingly, often biased.
Like what?
Well, for example, 82% of independently funded studies show harm from sugar-sweetened beverages. But flip that coin. 93% of industry-sponsored studies show no harm.
Convenient.
Very. The book even mentions a study based on a pretty problematic ranking system that ranked Lucky Charms as healthier to eat than whole foods like lamb or ground beef.
That Lucky Charms study is absolutely mind-boggling. It just makes you question everything you thought you knew about healthy food labels.
Doesn't it?
And this brings us to what the book calls the biggest lie in healthcare, which is that the reasons we're getting sicker, fatter, more depressed are complicated. The book says, no, it's not complicated.
It's a pretty radical assertion.
It is. So what makes it feel so complicated to us then, if it's not actually that complex? Is it just the system profiting, or are there mental hurdles too?
That's a great question because it absolutely feels complicated, right? The book argues that the complexity itself is kind of a narrative. It's fostered by a system that, well, benefits from it.
How so?
We're led to believe we need all these highly specialized interventions, complex medications, multiple doctors to solve our issues.
Instead of looking at the basics.
Exactly. Instead of looking at simple, foundational lifestyle choices, the system profits from that narrative of complexity, which leads to more interventions, and ultimately, the book argues, more sickness and dependency.
Wow.
The author insists the reasons are not complicated. They all tie back to these foundational good energy habits.
Okay, so this is where the deep dive really shifts focus, right? Towards empowering you, the listener.
Yes. This is the hopeful part.
The core message is pretty revolutionary. For chronic disease, you should trust your body, not necessarily just your doctor.
Important distinction there.
Right. This doesn't mean ignore medical advice for acute things where the system excels. But for those long-term chronic conditions, you are the primary person in charge of understanding your own body.
Yeah.
So what are the practical first steps? How does someone actually start trusting their body?
It really begins with reframing how we view common symptoms. Think about it. Fatigue, acne, headaches, anxiety, PMS, joint pain, getting sick all the time.
Yeah, stuff we often just put up with.
Right. We're told it's normal, maybe stress, maybe just aging. But the book says, no, these symptoms are actually gifts.
Gifts? How so?
They're critical check engine lights from your body. They're signaling that bad energy, that metabolic dysfunction is brewing at the cellular level. They're invitations to get curious.
And we're kind of entering a new era that supports this self-empowerment, right?
Yeah.
The author calls it bioobservability.
Exactly. It's a great term. With new tech like wearables, continuous monitors like CGMs, direct-to-consumer lab testing, you can actually observe your own biology in real time. It gives you unprecedented insight into what's happening inside your body.
Okay, so what exactly are these key metabolic biomarkers, these check engine alerts we should be looking for?
The book highlights several crucial ones. Let's start with 5 basic ones you might see on your annual checkup, but looking at them through a different lens. Not just normal, but optimal.
Okay.
First, triglycerides. These are basically a warning sign that you've got too much sugar, refined carbs, or maybe alcohol overwhelming your liver.
Right.
The standard normal range is often under 150 milli-GDL, but the book points out that the optimal range, the one linked to like 50% less cardiovascular risk, it's actually less than 80 milli-GDL.
Wow, that's a big difference, and often overlooked if you're just told you're normal.
Exactly. Often goes completely unaddressed.
Yeah, what's next?
Next, HDL cholesterol, often called the good cholesterol.
Hmm.
While the normal range is pretty broad, the book points to a kind of sweet spot for the lowest disease risk, which is somewhere between 50 and 90 mg/dl.
Okay, 50 to 90 for HDL. Got it.
Then there's fasting glucose. This measures your blood sugar after you haven't eaten for about 8 hours.
Standard test.
Right. But the problem is, a normal fasting glucose can actually hide brewing insulin resistance for years, even decades. How? Because your pancreas is working overtime, pumping out more and more insulin just to keep that blood sugar number looking normal. The book suggests an optimal range is more like 70 to 85 mg/dl.
Okay, 70 to 85. That's tighter. What about blood pressure?
Blood pressure is pretty straightforward, thankfully.
Hmm.
The optimal range is the same as what's generally considered normal. Less than 120 systolic and less than 80 diastolic MAHG.
Okay, that's easy enough. And the fifth basic one.
And finally, waist circumference. Sounds simple, but it's a really powerful indicator of that dangerous visceral and ectopic fat.
Not just the fat you can pinch.
No, this is the bad stuff that wraps around your internal organs, gets into places it shouldn't, like your liver. This type of fat actively drives inflammation and makes your cells less responsive to insulin.
So what are the optimal numbers?
Well, the normal ranges are often quite generous, but the International Diabetes Federation suggests tighter optimal ranges, typically less than 80 centimeters for women, which is about 31.5 inches, and less than 90 centimeters for men, around 35.5 inches, though it can vary a bit by ethnicity.
Okay, those are the basic 5. But the book really pushes for looking at some advanced markers too, right? Things not usually in a standard checkup.
Absolutely. These can give you much deeper insights into your metabolic health, often much earlier.
Like what?
The first big one is fasting insulin. Now, this is crucial. It's not a standard test in the US most of the time.
Really? Why not?
That's a good question. But testing fasting insulin can detect insulin resistance maybe a decade before your fasting glucose goes out of whack.
A whole decade. Wow.
Yeah, it's a huge window of opportunity for early intervention that's often completely missed. There's also a calculation called OME-IR, using glucose and insulin together. Optimal is less than 2.0.
Okay, fasting insulin and OME-IR. What else?
Then you've got liver enzymes, AST, ALT, and especially GGT. Elevated levels indicate liver cell damage, often from insulin resistance and fatty liver disease.
And the liver is super important for metabolism.
It's called the master orchestrator of metabolism, so its health is absolutely paramount for good energy. The book suggests optimal levels for these enzymes are quite a bit lower than the typical normal cutoffs.
Right, makes sense.
Vitamin D is another crucial one. It's not just a vitamin, it's actually a hormone.
Okay.
It's involved in dozens of critical functions: insulin secretion, immune function, antioxidant activity. Research suggests optimal ranges are probably 40 to 60 ng/ml, not just barely scraping above 20, which is often considered sufficient.
40 to 60. Okay. And what about cholesterol? You hear so much about LDL.
Ah, yes, the LDL-C nuance. This is a big one that challenges conventional wisdom.
How so?
The book, referencing experts like Dr. Robert Lustig, states that total cholesterol is basically meaningless on its own.
Meaningless. Really?
In terms of predicting risk, yeah. What matters is the type of LDL particles.
Yeah.
You need to distinguish between the large, fiery, buoyant ones, type A, which are generally neutral,
Okay.
and the small, dense, problematic ones, type B. Those are the ones highly predictive of heart attack risk.
And what drives those bad type B particles?
Crucially, and this is often missed, it's primarily refined carbohydrates and sugar, not just dietary fat, that drive the formation of these dangerous, small, dense particles.
So a statin might lower total LDL?
But it might only be lowering the harmless type A particles, potentially missing the real problem.
Fascinating. Okay, so knowing these numbers is one thing, but the book also talks about real-time data.
Yes. This is where things get really empowering, leveraging technology like continuous glucose monitors, CGMs.
The patches you wear.
Exactly. They show you, minute by minute, the immediate impact of food and activity on your blood sugar.
Wow.
They can identify subtle issues like big post-meal spikes or that dawn effect, the natural morning glucose rise, which might be exaggerated. Seeing this data is incredibly motivating for behavior change.
What's a good target for post-meal glucose?
The optimal target suggested is keeping it under 115 mg/dl after eating, with no more than about a 30 mg/dl rise from your pre-meal level.
Okay. What else can we track in real time?
Heart rate variability, HRV. This one sounds a bit counterintuitive.
Right.
More variability, more inconsistency in the time between your heartbeats is actually better. It indicates good health, resilience to stress. Low HRV is linked to chronic stress, chronic disease, and bad energy.
Interesting. So high HRV is good.
Exactly. Tracking it helps you understand your body's stress load and recovery state day to day.
Makes sense. And resting heart rate.
Your resting heart rate is also a really significant indicator. Simply put, lower is generally better. It shows your heart is working efficiently.
Hmm.
A higher resting heart rate, especially if it's consistently above, say, 80 beats per minute compared to an optimal below 60, is strongly linked to increased disease risk.
Okay. And then just basic activity tracking.
Yep. Don't forget simple activity data. Tracking your steps, sure, but also active hours. The book suggests moving for at least 90 seconds every hour.
90 seconds every hour. That's doable.
Totally. And aiming for about 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity per week. The book really hammers home that just sitting itself is the monster, regardless of whether you do a hard workout later.
Right. Continuous movement matters.
It really does. And finally, food journaling. This sounds basic, maybe tedious.
Yeah. I've tried and failed at that one.
Huh. Many of us have. But the author emphasizes its importance not just for accountability, but for truly understanding the molecular information you're putting into your body every single day.
Molecular information. I like that.
Yeah, it helps you connect what you eat to how you feel and how your biomarkers respond. It makes abstract concepts really concrete and personal.
Okay, so we've explored what bad energy is, how it happens, and how we can measure its impact. Now, the crucial part. How do we pivot to good energy?
Right, the action plan.
The book offers a clear blueprint, starting with what it calls the unholy trinity to eliminate from your diet. Sounds ominous.
It is in terms of health impact. First up, refined sugars.
Obvious one, maybe.
You'd think so, but the book explains why it's so bad. Fructose, in particular, impacts fat storage and hunger signals. It basically activates a survival switch.
Survival switch.
Yeah, it tells your body it's starving and needs to store fat for winter. But in our modern world, that winter never comes.
So we just keep storing fat.
Exactly. So this means cutting out the obvious stuff. Sodas, juices, all added sugar, candy, anything with high fructose corn syrup. Really reading labels.
Okay, number one, refined sugar. What's number two in the trinity?
Second, the book points a big finger at refined industrial vegetable and seed oils.
Okay, like what specifically?
These are the common ones: canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower, safflower, peanut, grapeseed. The list goes on.
Why are they so bad?
Well, a couple of reasons. They're extremely high in omega-6 fats, which throws off our crucial omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and that drives inflammation. Plus, the way they're extracted is highly processed, often using chemical solvents like hexane, extreme heat, bleaching, not exactly natural, and they are everywhere. Hidden in countless packaged foods, dressings, mayos, restaurant food.
You really have to look for them. Okay, so cut sugars, cut these refined oils. What's the third part of the unholy trinity?
The third leg is refined grains.
Like white bread, white rice.
Exactly. The refining process strips away the bran and the parts with the fiber and nutrients, leaving just the starchy endosperm.
Mm-hmm.
This means you lose the fiber, which leads to rapid blood sugar spikes, and you lose vital nutrients.
How much is too much?
The book points out that consuming over 350 grams of refined grains a day, which sounds like a lot, but could easily be, say, a serving of Cheerios, 2 slices of bread, a handful of pretzels, some cooked pasta, and maybe a cookie.
Yeah, that adds up quickly.
It does. And that level of consumption is associated with a 27% higher risk of death and a 33% higher risk of cardiovascular events. The goal, the book pretty bluntly says, is to aim for 0 grams.
Wow. Okay, 0 refined grains. So if we cut those 3 sugars, refined oils, refined grains, what should we be eating to build good energy?
Right, the positive side. The book outlines 5 pillars of good energy food.
Okay, pillar number 1.
The first is prioritizing micronutrients and antioxidants. These are absolutely vital for mitochondrial resilience. They protect your cells from that oxidative stress, that rusting we talked about.
So vitamins and minerals.
Yep. Think vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, B vitamins, alpha-lipoic acid, manganese, vitamin E, CoQ10.
Yeah.
You find these packed into colorful fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, quality animal products. Eat the rainbow, essentially.
Okay, eat the rainbow for micronutrients. Pillar 2.
Second, omega-3s. These are crucial for their anti-inflammatory role. They actually help resolve inflammation in your cell membranes, calming things down rather than letting it linger.
The opposite of those omega-6s and the bad oils.
Exactly. It's about getting that balance right. Excellent sources are fatty fish like salmon, sardines, mackerel, but also plant sources like chia seeds, flax seeds, and walnuts.
Good. Fill the three.
Third, fiber. Absolutely essential. It feeds your healthy gut microbes, slows down digestion, helps stabilize blood sugar.
Where do we get good fiber?
Lots of places. Chia, flax, nuts, seeds, avocados, beans, lentils, berries, non-starchy vegetables. The book actually recommends aiming for at least 50 grams of fiber per day, which is quite a bit more than most people get.
50 grams. Okay. Pillar 4.
Fourth, fermented foods. These are critical for balancing your gut microbiome. They contain beneficial bacteria and yeasts, and they help your gut produce beneficial compounds called postbiotics, like short-chain fatty acids.
Which are important for metabolism.
Hugely important. Think unsweetened yogurt or kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, natto if you're adventurous. Incorporating these regularly is key.
Okay. Fermented foods. And the fifth pillar.
And finally, pillar number 5 is protein. This is indispensable, not just for building and maintaining muscle. Muscle itself acts like a glucose-absorbing sink, helping you manage blood sugar.
Ah, interesting.
But also, when you use your muscles, they release anti-inflammatory signaling molecules called myokines. They act like natural anti-inflammatories.
So how much protein?
The book recommends aiming for about 30 grams of high-quality protein per meal, from sources like meats, fish, poultry, dairy, eggs, but also legumes, tofu, tempeh, nuts, and seeds.
30 grams per meal. Got it.
Hmm.
The book also mentions food sourcing, right? Does it matter where our food comes from?
It does, significantly. It contrasts conventional farming, think pesticides, monocropping, with organic, which is better. But the ideal, the book argues, is regenerative farming. These practices actually improve soil health, sequester carbon, and lead to foods that are demonstrably more nutrient-dense with higher levels of things like omega-3s and antioxidants.
Regenerative. Okay, something to look for. What about just basic hydration?
Oh, fundamental. Beyond just, needing water, the book reveals this fascinating link between even mild dehydration and obesity.
Really?
It explains that dehydration can actually trick your body into making a type of sugar, fructose, internally through something called the polyol pathway.
The body makes its own sugar.
Yeah, and that signals it to store fat, almost like it's preparing for a drought, like how camels store water as fat in their humps.
Wow. So how much should we drink?
The recommendation is pretty simple. Drink at least half an ounce of clean, filtered water per pound of your body weight daily. Maybe more if you're active or it's hot.
Half an ounce per pound. Okay. So food and water are huge. But the good energy blueprint goes way beyond just diet, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It delves deep into our daily lifestyle habits.
What's one of the most foundational, maybe overlooked habits the book emphasizes?
I'd say circadian rhythm and light is huge. The book stresses the profound importance of getting bright morning sunlight exposure directly into your eyes, no windows, no sunglasses, ideally within 30-60 minutes of waking.
Why is it so important?
It acts like the master on switch for your entire body clock. It sets your hormones, your metabolism, optimizes nearly every bodily function for the day ahead.
And then avoiding artificial light at night.
Exactly. Minimizing exposure to bright, especially blue, light in the evening helps maintain that critical rhythm, signaling to your body that it's time to wind down and prepare for restorative sleep.
Which brings us to sleep.
The ultimate restorative process. The book reiterates that magic number of 7 to 8 hours for most adults. And remember that stat. Even just 4 hours for 6 nights can induce pre-diabetic changes and damage mitochondria. It becomes this vicious cycle.
How so?
Bad energy makes it harder to sleep well, and then lack of sleep makes your bad energy even worse. It's a downward spiral you have to consciously break.
Right. Then there's movement. We touched on sitting being the monster.
Yeah, and the emphasis is on continuous low-level movement. Get up for 90 seconds every hour, just fidget, walk around, do some squats.
In addition to dedicated exercise.
Right. And resistance training gets a big nod for building muscle mass because muscle is so metabolically active and helps with insulin sensitivity. And simple things like just walking for 15 minutes after meals, that can blunt glucose spikes by up to 30%.
30% just from a walk. That's significant.
It is. The book also introduces the idea of using controlled discomfort, things like cold exposure, cold showers, plunges, or heat exposure, sauna.
Why do that? Sounds uncomfortable.
It is. But these stressors in controlled doses can powerfully boost metabolic resilience and activate brown fat, a special type of fat that actually burns glucose and fat to generate heat.
Interesting. Okay, what about those toxins we talked about earlier? How do we avoid them?
Toxin avoidance is key. Given the sheer number of chemicals, the book offers practical tips.
Mhm.
Filter your air and water. Choose unprocessed organic or ideally regenerative foods when possible.
Mm.
Avoid storing or heating food in plastic. Swap out scented home and personal care products, perfumes, air fresheners, cleaners for unscented, clean alternatives.
What about food ingredients?
Big offenders are often hidden in plain sight. Things listed as natural flavors, artificial dyes. They sound harmless, but can be problematic. Read ingredient lists carefully.
Okay, and finally, the mind-body connection. Stress.
Hugely important. Chronic psychological stress translates directly into physical inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction.
So what can we do?
The book encourages practices like mindfulness meditation. Even just 10 minutes a day can make a difference. Cultivating feelings of awe and gratitude. Building strong community ties. Loneliness is surprisingly linked to poor metabolic health.
Hmm.
And of course, seeking professional support to process trauma if needed. The underlying idea is powerful. We can train our brain to heal, and our mental state profoundly impacts our physical energy.
That's a lot to consider. Covers so many areas of life. But what's great is the book includes this hierarchy of competence framework.
Yes, that's really helpful.
It's a way for you, the listener, to rate your proficiency in these different good energy habits from being like unconsciously incompetent, not even knowing you don't know, all the way to unconsciously competent, doing it automatically.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds incredibly practical.
Mm-hmm.
So for someone feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed by all this, if they pick just one area using that framework, say sleep, what's one immediate, small, good energy step the book might suggest to just get started?
It's all about personalizing the path. You don't have
Yeah.
to overhaul everything overnight.
Right.
If sleep is your focus, maybe the first step is just ensuring you get that bright morning light exposure within 30 minutes of waking. That's it. Start there.
Okay.
Or for diet, maybe it's just cutting out sugary drinks. That one change can have a big impact. The hierarchy of competence helps you identify where you're currently at a lower level, and making those small incremental changes there often yields the biggest results initially.
That makes sense. Start where you are, small steps.
Hmm.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener, beyond just the practical tips?
Yeah, the bigger picture.
The book leaves us with this incredibly optimistic message, doesn't it? That this chronic illness crisis, it is fixable. And that you absolutely have the power to profoundly influence your own health trajectory.
Understanding cellular energy, the book argues, it's like the solid gold key to unlocking vibrant, maybe even limitless health.
Yeah.
And what's truly thought-provoking, I think, is how the book encourages us to see our personal biology not in isolation, but as, well, inextricably interconnected with the natural world,
How so?
with the soil, the plants, even our ancestors. I mean, think about it. Your mitochondria are inherited solely from your mother in an unbroken lineage stretching back millennia.
Wow, I never thought of it like that.
It's profound, right? So the book kind of positions choosing good energy not just as a personal health choice, but almost as an act of rebellion.
Rebellion. Against what?
Yeah. Against the systems, the societal norms that seem designed to keep us sick, disconnected, and dependent. By actively nurturing your own good energy, you're embracing this deeper truth of connectedness and the potential outcome, leading a fearless, maximally positive experience of your one life, a life truly brimming with vitality.